I'm just as guilty as anyone of addictive overconsumption and engaging in retail therapy. It's an extremely easy trap to fall into, especially for musicians that focus on electronic music, but it's certainly not exclusive to the electronic music community. It's such a cliche that I feel silly and self-conscious even vocalizing the common internet shorthand for this compulsive and pathological behavior. I'm beating a dead horse by even mentioning that we're bombarded with advertising, both overt and covert. I'm preaching to the choir when I say that limitations breed creativity, and some of your favorite music was often made with less gear than you bought in the last year. I'm stating the obvious when I point out that it's less about the tools and more about how you use them. The most important thing here is to be honest with yourself and attempt to be self-aware about why you are buying any particular piece of gear. I don't think it's inherently wrong to want a piece of gear simply because you think it will be fun. I don't think it's inherently wrong to have a studio full of gear, even if you never release a single piece of music. What I think is wrong is when we lie to ourselves about why we are doing these things. It's addictively seductive to imagine what a new piece of gear can do for us, but so often the expectation and anticipation far exceeds the reality. We get the new shiny, we have a brief experience of novelty, and almost immediately we start to dream about what the next piece of gear we need is going to do for us. Or we focus on all of the things our new toy can't do, so we can begin to externalize our disappointment and abdicate any personal responsibility for our negative emotional state. To record audio, we need some amount of recording gear, and to make electronic music, we need some amount of electronic music equipment. Similarly, different ways of working, different types of desired outcomes, and different mindsets are going to lead to varied answers to the question of what do you actually need. Maybe your goal isn't to make and record music, in which case I don't think my thoughts are very useful for you. The mindset of a collector is fundamentally materialistic, and the enjoyment experienced by the collector is primarily in the passive act of possession and in the activity of additional acquisition. A collector isn't fundamentally concerned about the utility of what they are collecting. Many collections have no inherent utility of any kind. Many times I have experienced the compulsion to collect things, but it's never an impulse that leaves me with any lasting satisfaction, so it's a mindset I try to avoid. The main issue that I have experienced and seen echoed in the experiences of others is that when we set out to acquire some gear to help us realize our musical desires, we can easily get sidetracked by pleasurable feelings we get from simply owning things we enjoy. And then we want to keep chasing that feeling. We start to care more about the next piece of gear that just got announced than using the things we already have. We watch videos of old heads waxing rhapsodic about vintage gear that was released before we were born, imagining that possessing a mystical piece of faux nostalgia is going to get us where we want to go. We spend inordinate amounts of time searching for the next piece of equipment that we're convinced will break us through to new musical heights. We spend time on forums and social media debating the relative merits of our gear instead of just using it. This obsessive focus on the tools even applies when we aren't spending any money at all. Software piracy is endemic to the electronic music community, and some aspiring creatives end up spending more time trying to get their hands on every DAW and plugin possible than actually making music. It's likely most of the music they admire was produced with digital tools that had a fraction of the capabilities of completely free tools available today, which you could also easily spend all of your time collecting and comparing instead of learning them and using them to actually produce anything. We spend incredible amounts of time compulsively organizing our gear, building custom desks for it, manufacturing bespoke cases, obsessing over esoteric modifications, sourcing special knobs, 3D printing new faceplates, and on and on. It's an endless array of activities available that often have little to do with working on the craft of music. It's not that these things are inherently useless or a waste of time. I've done plenty of them myself, and they can be very helpful in many ways. The issue is knowing where to draw the line. Which of these things is actually going to be worth your time? Are you here to make music, or are you here to make music accessories? There's nothing wrong with either, as long as the goal you're working towards satisfies your creative needs. Making music and growing as a musician requires substantial time and effort. If you're spending your time doing all these other things, you're just not developing the way you could be. The less gear you have, the more time you have to spend figuring out what you want to say and how you're going to say it with the tools you already have. Music equipment shouldn't be getting in the way of making music. It should be facilitating it. But it's your responsibility to figure out how to make that happen. It's your responsibility to draw the line in the sand. I have a plethora of gear, much more than I need. I used to have even more than I do now. I primarily deal with my excess of gear by simply not using most of it most of the time, and deciding in advance when sitting down to play with sound what exact equipment I'm going to use, and staying within those self-imposed limits. That's one of the reasons I primarily produce music using hardware instead of software. The limitations tend to be much more concrete, and I'm generally forced to be more economical and thoughtful about my creative decisions. I really appreciate the No Gear, New Year threads you can find on Modwiggler and Electronauts, despite it feeling like holding an AA meeting in a bar. The Modwiggler thread encourages folks to join a dedicated Discord, which helps mitigate this aspect. I feel a bit guilty when someone comments on one of my videos that something I made inspired them to buy a piece of gear. I want to share my love for these really cool musical instruments that some of us are fortunate enough to be able to own and use, but I don't really want to feel responsible for how people choose to spend their money. Since using a piece of gear is an implicit endorsement, I try to balance that out. Sometimes my criticism is rather tongue-in-cheek, like my video about why you shouldn't buy an Octatrack, although some of the issues I raise in that video are valid pain points. Other times my aim is a bit more philosophical, like my video on the Tonewerk. What's most interesting to me about releasing these ostensibly negative critiques is the way in which some people take offense. I think it's important to realize that these are just boxes that make noise. If someone trash talks your favorite piece of gear and it makes you upset, it tends to speak directly to the ways in which you've emotionally invested and personally identified with an inanimate object. Despite all their warts and shortcomings, I enjoy using the Electron boxes I own. There are numerous legitimate criticisms that can be made, but none of that matters to me. They are what they are, and I'm fine with that. If someone else's opinion of a piece of gear or a manufacturer means that much to you, I would encourage some self-examination, regardless of how seemingly valid or disgustingly ignorant their opinion might be. I watched an interview recently that Fantano had with a music critic from The New Yorker, who made the argument that music critics are generally being too nice these days, and how it's important that we're able to experience a diversity of opinions. Notably, he highlighted the self-censoring impact of social media on criticism due to its immediacy and intimacy. He related this to how our experience with music is such a personal and emotional thing that can have profound influence on the ways in which we self-identify. And if someone we're talking to criticizes our favorite music, we're liable to take that criticism personally and have a disproportionate negative reaction. This tribalistic tendency and these curious emotional attachments clearly extend to our musical equipment, even though such attachments make little sense from a purely rational perspective. It's just stuff. On the extreme end, it's even quite harmful, locking us into patterns of behavior and discouraging us from shifting our perspective. This overabundance of irrational attachment is suffering. I don't think I'm any more enlightened than anyone else, and I wouldn't be happy if all my gear suddenly vanished, but I honestly don't think it would matter that much in the grand scheme of things. If I wanted to make electronic music again, I'd need something to do it with, and some way in which I could record it. But if I'm open-minded about what the end result might look like, I really wouldn't need much to make meaningful artistic statements. Over 20 years ago, before I even considered myself someone that produced or even listened to electronic music, I took a course where we had an assignment to make a piece of music using only Audacity and an album of copyright-free songs. I didn't come up with anything spectacular, but I really wish I still had that track. I thought I had it backed up somewhere, but I've never been able to find it. Some of my classmates with more knowledge and experience made things I couldn't have anticipated. It taught me that simple tools are more than enough to make rather advanced and impactful electronic music. We're mainly held back by our erroneous preconceptions and fears that dictate so much of our thoughts and behaviors if we let them. For myself, having spent so much time and money on music and audio gear already, almost any purchase I might make is largely an exercise in consumerist fetishization. Although new gear might encourage me to go down different paths, it's not as if those paths are any more valid or important than the ones I already have available. So I encourage you to think more about the gear you already have and to be very skeptical about any purchase you might make. Even when considering the less exciting purchases, like audio interfaces or studio monitors, don't spend too much time scrutinizing your options, and always give yourself an extra day, week, month, year, or even decade before you make a decision, while you continue to put your focus where it really matters, whatever that means for you.